This is Platemark with me, Ann Shafer. Platemark is a podcast about prints and the printmaking ecosystem. We're talking about fine art prints, etchings, lithographs, screen prints, woodcuts, things of that nature, usually in limited editions, although not always. If you've been following along, you know that I love to talk to printers and makers, artists of all sorts, but today I've got a treat for you. Sometimes a new book shows up and you just can't resist the opportunity to dive in, check it out, absorb it all, and then find the author and talk to them. And in this case, it just so happens that I know the author. Susan Dackerman is my guest today. She is an art historian and scholar of Albrecht Dürer, who we have talked about quite a lot over on the History of Print series with True Ludwig. Susan's written a new book called Dürer's Knots, Early European Print and the Islamic East, in which she takes a deep dive into Dürer's printed images that reference the Islamic world. Within the book, she separates out 3 different prints or series of prints. And the first one is the sea monster, in which there's a small person on the shore that's waving at the main action that's wearing a Muslim turban. In the second section, she's looking at Dürer's knots that are 6 woodcuts that portray Islamic patterning that are from brass vessels inlaid with silver wire designs. And she points out in this effort to remind us all that there are connections that go beyond just the visual in the fine arts, that Nuremberg, Dürer's hometown, is where those silver wires were made. They were the center of silver wire manufacturing. So there are all these strange and wonderful connections that Susan makes really clear and just brings everything to light. And the last is the landscape with the cannon, which does feature several people who have Muslim turbans on. So the way we have looked at Dürer is to look at it from a very Western European-centric point of view. And Susan asks the question, what happens if we remember that there was a lot more going on than just what was happening in Germany or Venice, where Dürer spent several years? There was lots of trade going on. There was lots of cross-cultural sharing of design details, architecture, textiles, you name it. And there was, of course, exchanges of ideas. So it wasn't only that that Western Europeans were in military conflict with the Ottoman Empire and such. There was a really rich back and forth of cultures going on. And so the book dives into all of that, and it's fascinating. There were points in there when I just would close the book and go, oh my God, I need to talk to Susan about this. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Okay, housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Images Susan and I talk about are over in the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. Over there, you can also leave me a message, write a review, support the pod, help me keep the lights on. I'd appreciate it. All right, let's get rolling. Susan, it is fabulous to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark today.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks for inviting me.
You are very welcome. I always like to let people know we know each other. We used to work together in Baltimore. And so it's been a long time since we've sat down and chatted about you and your work. So I'm excited.
I am as well.
Good. Can you tell everybody who you are and what you're up to?
I'm Susan Dackerman. I am a curator and art historian who focuses on Northern European print culture. I have, over the last 25 or 30 years, made a number of exhibitions and made exhibition catalogs, and I have recently written a book on Albrecht Dürer and his relationship to the Islamic world.
Which I just finished reading yesterday, and I have to say, it was fascinating because you touch on not only sort of the art historical minutia, but you've broken through this idea of I never thought about the Ottoman Empire when I look at Western prints. And so I think it's a groundbreaker. It's so exciting.
Thank you for saying that. I think one of the things that has happened in art history is that when we think about early modern or Renaissance art, we immediately make reference to the classical world because so much of what was made during that period does in fact reference the classical world, but we've done it to the exclusion of contemporary history. I was interested in thinking about what happens if you don't put Dürer's work in the context of classical history, but instead think about contemporary history? And of course, Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean and West Asia and North Africa were in constant contact at the time, and that is reflected in a good number of his prints.
I feel like when I think about that time, I mean, and I'm no, historian by any stretch of this era, but I think of like the trade routes, but I never considered the impact of the trade routes. I just think of it as exchanges of goods, not of ideas and visual design sort of ideas. It's weird.
I think that's pretty common. And I think we also forget that if you're in one of those places where there is a lot of commerce and trade and exchange, you meet people from those places along the routes of exchange. So I think that there are various ways that those trade routes influenced what people knew, what they saw, what they did. And someone like Dürer, who was, I think, supremely curious and perceptive and cosmopolitan, incorporated that into his work.
I also, when I was reading the book, kept thinking, my God, he must be one of the most trod over artists, research-wise. How in the world is there possibly anything new? And I was fascinated by the piecing together of like the actual points of contact, the warehouse in Venice where all of the German families were kind of held in. I was like, wow, how in the world did you find all that stuff?
Well, the funny thing about that warehouse, the Fondaco de Tedeschi, is that it still exists in Venice and is now an upscale luxury mall. And so it functions in the same way. Now, you can buy a Louis Vuitton bag or a Chanel suit or other international goods in this building that is its architecture is influenced by Islamic design. So, there are still real traces of it.
Yeah. And when you say Islamic design, of course, it's always there in the architecture. If you travel in southern Spain or in Venice, I mean, it's clear, but gosh, I swear in my mind, the Venetian sort of style that is so Islamic, when you really think about it, to me was all just Venetian.
Yeah, it's been assimilated and become part of the local design vocabulary.
Right. Yeah. It's so beautiful. I love Venice. Did you I'm sure you traveled for the research on this book. Did you spend a lot of time did you go to Istanbul?
I did not go to Istanbul.
Oh, it's on my list.
It's on my list as well. And the other place that's, of course, really important is Alexandria as a port in Egypt and Damascus in Syria. But most of the research took place in Nuremberg and Venice. It was a new way of looking at Venice, a way of looking freshly at Venice for me, looking at the work of Carpaccio, following the trail of the Mamluk points of contact and the Ottoman points of contact in the city. So it was a way of looking at things that I'd seen already, but looking at them freshly. And the prints, though, too, like every time I do a project, I thought of this project, or this project began to emerge in my mind when I was working on Prints in the Pursuit of Knowledge. And I was just going through box after box of prints by Dürer, prints by his contemporaries. And even though while I was doing that research, I was looking for references to early science, I was seeing all of these depictions of Muslim figures and events and materials and wondering why I wasn't reading about that. Like, why wasn't that part of the learning about the Renaissance in Northern Europe and learning about Dürer? And so I think that there are lots of ways to look at the art that we know so well, that's canonical, that allows us to open new perspectives. It's just, the canon is more than a set of objects. The canon is also a set of ideas, a set of prescriptions in how we look. And when we say we want to break down the canon, it's not only about looking at new objects, but looking differently at things. So it's something that I tried to do with this project.
I think you did it really well because, usually, because I'm not a scholar of Northern Renaissance stuff, when I start reading about it, generally I'm like, oh, here we go again. But this one, you're breaking down the art history that has led to this very narrow canon idea. And you're telling us about Panofsky or whoever it is. And it's almost, I'm sure that there is some theoretical way that you've approached it. But to me, it became more personal. And I felt like I was following you through your thinking and discovery of it in a way that you don't usually get with the really dry textbooky sort of stuff.
I think that if you want to break down the canon in all different ways, you actually have to offer up new methodologies. And I tried to do that in the book, as you know, by offering references to innovations in natural science and how scientists, especially those who work on nature, are trying to think more about affiliation than competition. That we have these ideas about competition and conflict that drive nature. But there are also all these ways of cooperation that enable a kind of sustainability. And I think incorporating the ideas from other fields into the humanities, into art history specifically, allow you to think through the images differently. And it was what I was after.
Well, the whole idea about us never thinking about Islam in connection with Western prints.
Right.
Exhibit A.
And always imagining Islam as the enemy rather than the trading partner, rather than the purveyor of sophisticated design. It just opens up new perspectives.
Right. Yeah, you just want to be a fly on the wall in that Fondaco Tedeschi. Let's back up a little bit. Tell us about when you first figured out that you wanted to do the whole print thing, because, not many of us had history of prints in school.
I did not, in fact, have the history of prints in school, although I was an undergraduate at Vassar College, and they had a very good print collection. We looked at Dürers and Rembrandts and all kinds of prints as part of our introductions and surveys of different fields. So I got some of it there. But it was really in graduate school, my first semester, where I took a Northern Renaissance seminar, and the professor, James Snyder, in a very old-fashioned way, assigned seminar topics. And I was assigned a research project on Lucas Cranach's woodcuts on the power of women. And at the moment, I was very disappointed that everyone else had gotten these great painting assignments, and I was going to work on these little scrappy pieces of paper. But clearly, they triggered some interest because here I am, 30 years later, still thinking about those pieces of paper with printed black lines on them. So it was completely fortuitous that I have ended up a print scholar.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I think so many of us backed into it without realizing it.
Yeah. And once I realized that I wanted to write a dissertation about prints, my dissertation advisor, Christiana Herdel, said to me that I had to go and get an internship at a museum so that I could actually deal with the objects themselves. And I applied for an internship at the Harvard Art Museums and ended up in the print department there working with Jerry Cohn, who is the print curator and to whom this Dürer book is in fact dedicated. She really taught me so much about the materiality of prints, the meaning of prints, that year was really transformative for me. And it changed my mind completely from imagining that I was going to go off and be a professor to I was going to look for a curatorial job at a museum. And as you know, I ended up at the Baltimore Museum where we met.
That's right.
Many decades ago.
Many decades ago. Yeah. You were upstairs in the print department. I was downstairs twiddling my thumbs, waiting for the right job to open up. But it all worked out in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you worked on some, one particularly well-regarded and beautiful exhibition while you were in Baltimore with the conservator Tom Primo, who's a mutual friend, about painted prints. And I felt like that one, people still are like, my God, did you see, it was so incredible. And it was, I think, a watershed for print scholars.
Yeah. In fact, in the last few years, I have been invited to do a number of things around hand-colored prints again. I went to a week-long workshop in Warsaw 2 summers ago. And this March 2025, I'll participate in a session at the Renaissance Society of America conference on hand-colored prints that is being run by a number of European graduate students. So I'm delighted that it's still out there as a topic of interest to people.
I hope you didn't throw out your notes. Never throw out your notes.
No.
No. It really was revelatory. And you bought, for the BMA, you bought a beautiful Dürer, the presentation in the temple, the Ecce Homo. And I pulled it out every time True brought his class in, every single time, pulled them both out. And people were the students were like, what? Like, couldn't get over it.
It's funny because I think with that show, I established myself as someone who kind of works on the margins of Dürer. There's a certain kind of Dürer scholar who writes about the iconic paintings and prints. And in that instance, I was working on, as you know, the application of color to Dürer's woodcuts and engravings, which people found outrageously transgressive. But in fact, it was done by well-trained professionals whose histories are accounted for, who were in many cases contemporaries of Dürer. It was one of those examples of me working on the Dürer fringe.
I like that. That's good. It describes you well. But do you think the thing we always talked about when we pulled them out for classes was whether or not Dürer would have approved of the coloring, the added coloring? And I'm sure you're asked this every time someone brings up the topic. Would he have approved?
Would Dürer have approved of the coloring? I would argue yes, that in fact, it was a very colorful moment in history. There was painted glass, there were tapestries, as well as all the paintings, and there were hand-colored books and illuminated manuscripts. So why not add color to this other medium? I don't think that he would have been wild about using opaque coloring that covered up the lines, but there are a lot of cases where the line remains entirely legible. And if you think about some of the pen and ink drawings that he made, that he then colored with watercolor, there are real similarities there. So yes, I think Dürer would have approved.
Okay. He was a master marketer, right? Like he got it.
Yeah.
I feel like he was, I don't know, maybe you can tell me, like the first person to really get the power of marketing.
I think that is an important story that's told about him, and the way that he produced paintings and I guess more often prints for specific markets is something that speaks to that canniness he had around selling his work. For instance, in the book, I suggest that his Meerwunder engraving was in fact produced for an Italian audience, an audience who would have better known the history of a relationship between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate than perhaps those in Nuremberg and further north in Germany.
I had never noticed the little Muslim cock on the shore. I'm embarrassed to say now.
Well, I think that's very typical, actually. And, I think that we've been taught to eliminate in the visual field what we don't understand. And we don't understand immediately why he's there. And so we overlook him. Panofsky suggests that he is the father of the female figure who is being transported away from the shore by the Triton.
That's what I would have assumed if I had not read your book, had I noticed him. I have to say, it was great to read about it in your, super thorough explanation of what's pointing where and, what's lining up with what. But it is confusing if you don't have any context, because she looks sort of placid, but she looks like she's being the whole thing is confusing. It's very particular to a moment in time and to a particular set of understood circumstances that kind of have gotten lost.
Yes. So let me just say, so that it's clear to those who are listening, that what I propose is that the female figure represents Caterina Cornero, who was a Venetian noblewoman who at a young age was married to the king of Cyprus and brought to Cyprus. And what we are seeing is her abdication of the throne from Cyprus as she's being called back to Venice so Venice can take over their supervision of Cyprus. But I think one of the problems with the obscurity of the meaning of the print is, as Americans, certainly we are taught very little about the history of Cyprus, about its Venetian control, about the Mamluk control, and about the Ottoman control. And then once it becomes an Ottoman state, like all of that previous history is lost in a way. And I think that that's something that Dürer's more narrative prints have suffered, that the history was known at the time that they were made, but it was a complicated history. It was a history about the current political, commercial, artistic moment. And over the past 500 years, we've shed a lot of that knowledge.
But also, you explain why he included the little city on the hill. It's not Nuremberg, it's another city, right?
Well, it's the castle from Nuremberg.
Okay. And why would that be if the island is Cyprus from which she is being taken? You know what I mean? Like it's so packed with ideas and twists and turns. It's almost impossible.
Right.
Good job, Albrecht.
Yeah, I think he was a complicated artist. He knew a lot. He was interested in visual complexity. He was interested in visual puns. And I think that what's easiest for history to sustain is simplicity.
Yeah.
Not complexity.
Yeah, I think, we can all pull out the biblical imagery and be happy with that because we all get it.
Right.
Or most of us do.
And I think that if you go over his work, there is so much complexity, whether he was working with early or proto-scientists, anatomists, cosmologists, or whether he was involved in the politics and the networks of exchange. Like, he was a complicated guy who made complicated pictures.
Right. And it's also, speaking of trying to simplify everything, like I think of the Ottomans versus the Western Europeans, but then you've got the Reformation coming up and the Catholics and there's like 25 different things that you have to keep track of. You're right. He's complicated, but I think it's great that you've pulled it apart for us. It's great.
But I think that if you lived in 1518, you would have been aware of all of those different factions, Catholicism versus Protestantism, the different empires that were important at the moment. I mean, we think of the Holy Roman Empire almost existing alone, but in fact, right next to it was the Ottoman Empire. Right alongside was this Mamluk Sultanate. There were the Safavids in Iran, or what we call Iran. So it was knowledge that people had in their day.
But like, how easy was it for somebody living in, the northern climes of Germany to get the news, quote unquote, the political news? Like, I mean, I get it, the printing press and all that stuff, but we're not publishing newspapers, are we?
No, but we're publishing broadsheets that have news. A lot of news was passed verbally as well. I think that Dürer existed in a time when people told each other stories. And you went to a place and you heard the stories of that place. And when he went to Venice, he heard stories that were different from the stories that he heard in Nuremberg. And so in the wake of both his visits to Venice, there are images that are made that reference Islamic culture. So, I think it has to do with proximity to people who held that information.
It's kind of remarkable how
It is remarkable.
it's kind of crazy. So then the middle chapter of the book looks at the woodcuts of these beautiful patterns, these so-called knots, which aren't really knots in the end, right?
So the title of the book refers to a series of 6 Dürer woodcuts that represent geometric designs composed of white lines on a dark ground. Dürer himself called them the knots, and in some ways they are knots. They represent entanglements or intertwinings, but they're not knots in the sense of being continuous lines that represent something that could be used to make a closure. So they are knots and they're not knots.
We didn't have any of those at the BMA, or did I just miss that box?
I'm not sure whether they were in the Baltimore collection. It's worth looking, though, because the Baltimore collection of art has such great Dürer prints that they might be there.
They might be there. Yeah.
But I didn't know what they were at the time. I didn't understand them. Panofsky essentially writes them off. I went to Baltimore right out of graduate school. My thinking would have been very much aligned with the primary Dürer text. And so I probably would have thought that they weren't as important as I do now.
Right. And they have a really interesting connection with Leonardo.
They are based on engravings of the same patterns that Leonardo or the school of Leonardo made in the years prior to Dürer's woodcuts.
But they all reference an Islamic kind of metalwork.
I think that they do.
Wait, you don't know? Wait, hold on.
No, they do. They reference a kind of Mamluk metalwork, these brass vessels that have inlaid silver wire designs. And I think the white lines of both the Leonardo engravings and the Dürer woodcuts replicate the designs of such metalwork. I think Dürer saw Leonardo's engravings. He must have had a set of them because he copied them very precisely. And he also saw the metalwork that it was based on. And I think he thought he could materially outdo Leonardo by making those designs as woodcuts rather than engravings. and this is an argument you and others have heard me make before, and some buy it and some don't, but I totally stand by it. I think that Dürer was very much aware of the kind of embossing that happens when one makes a woodcut. That because of the pressure of the paper being forced into the cutaway areas of the wood block, those unprinted areas stand up, are embossed. And so with the white lines of these knots, he was actually able to replicate the way that the silver wire filigree of these brass vessels stood up. And I think it was one of the ways that he outdid Leonardo in his mind.
I love that. When I read that in your book, I thought, well, but the engraved line, I mean, I get it that it wouldn't be the right line, but the engraved lines will stand kind of proud too if you got a lot of ink on there, right?
Yeah, but it's not actually the wire that's standing up. It's the printed background that's achieved through, that dense cross-hatching that doesn't, in fact, mimic the feel of the bowl with the silver embedded in it.
And there was a reason why at this particular moment that Dürer felt that these would be marketable. And what was it that they stopped making them? What happened?
He was in Venice the second time between 1505 and 1507. And it was a time that there was a halt in trade between the Mamluk Sultanate and Venice, a temporary hiatus. And the trade in those vessels was very dependent on Dürer's hometown of Nuremberg because it was where the wire was produced. So Nuremberg, during Dürer's lifetime, was the primary producer of wire in the world. And Dürer was very much aware of that because of all the wire mills along the Pegnitz River around Nuremberg. And that wire was one of the primary exports from Nuremberg to Venice and then from Venice to Alexandria. It was the kind of wire that then got used in the production of that Islamic metalwork, which in some cases was made for export. And so then it ended up going back to Venice to be sold in Europe. So Dürer was aware that this hometown commodity was part of a circular trade through the Islamic world. And he made a version of it out of paper. And again, the trade at that time was with the Mamluk Sultanate, which comprised North Africa, Egypt, and West Asia, Syria. And in 1517, the Ottomans took over that territory. And so once the Mamluks were gone, knowledge of that sultanate diminished as well. And so again, they became prints, Dürer's woodcuts became images that were misunderstood because the history had gotten obscured by political upheaval after political upheaval. And so those woodcuts are known in the literature mostly as embroidery designs. And if you look closely at the lines, you can tell that it's metal, that it's durable, cylindrical wire, not a fabric, not a thread. So, it's again one of those we've been taught to see it as embroidery, and so we see embroidery. But if you look differently and you have the history and context in mind, you can see something else.
I love that connection with the wire mills and everything. When I read that, I'm like, oh my God. Ooh, no. Well, you did. But the truth is, whether it was embroidery or metalwork, the sort of design templates of the Mamluk were preserved through his making of them. whatever they were derived from. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. And so after learning that about Mamluk metalwork, which is something that Hans Belting suggests, just to give him the credit for it, now when I go to museums and look at the Islamic collections, I see that Mamluk metalwork everywhere. And museums like the Courtauld have actually put that metalwork in the same room as the Venetian paintings of the period so that the connections could be better understood. And then, of course, you begin to see the Mamluk metalwork depicted in Venetian painting. And it's everywhere. So it was something that was known both through the objects themselves and then through the representation of those objects in other contemporary Italian paintings.
The other thing that's so great about the tale you're weaving is this reminder, because even within the study of Western art history, the Northern Renaissance-y thing it's like a little cocoon of hyper real whatever. And I completely forget that Bellini and Carpaccio are sitting there painting while Dürer's wandering around Venice. Like the interconnectivity has gotten a little bit lost for the general scholar, or general student, I should say.
And not only are Bellini and Carpaccio painting, but there are emissaries and political ambassadors from these Islamic empires that are also in Venice at the time. So it has a much more real, authentic component for him in terms of seeing the mix.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing. Dürer fascinates me. He's kind of like an artistic hero of yours and mine, and you want to know. I want to know. He's a good guy.
Well, he has left all of that writing. So we do have a sense of his personality, at least through the lens of the writing that survives.
And then the third chapter looks at the etching of the canon, which I have to say, I'm so fascinated by your pulling apart of the imagery, mainly because in the etching, each line is of almost an identical thickness, and so that the details kind of get lost. Like I have a hard time finding the faces on some of the guys and the part about the tree, and I'm like, what? And then, oh, there it is. And, we always told the tale in the study room that he didn't really like the etching and he went back to engraving or whatever. But do you feel like he was using etching for this specifically because of the quality of the line?
I think he used etching specifically for the landscape with canon because of the associated meanings of etching. I think he was aware that etching was related to military endeavors, armor, and cannons, and ultimately etching was possible because of the greater production of gunpowder, that the mordant, the etching acid, comes from a byproduct of making gunpowder. Now, Dürer etched on iron, so even if he knew that, he doesn't play that out on that particular sheet. But I think that the connections between etching and armory are clear to him in choosing the medium for that particular image.
Well, and if your supposition about him using woodcuts to outdo Leonardo because of the materiality, that makes complete sense that he's thinking along those lines.
I think that, as you suggest, Dürer is an artist who uses materiality to engender or even deepen the meanings that he's created in the imagery. The materiality affirms the image often. He doesn't choose his techniques lightly. He chooses them very intentionally. And I don't think that's something that a lot of people think about. They think, well, everyone was making woodcuts, so he'd make a woodcut. But I think he was much more considered than that. What would he get materially from making a woodcut that would be different from what he got materially from making an engraving or an etching. And I think that he played that card over and over and over as he made images.
Do you feel like other artists at the same time had that same conceptual through line that Dürer does? Because it's a really contemporary kind of, well, in my brain, because I look at contemporary, but like Hayter always was very conscious of which one he was using for what realm or whatever, and it felt pretty modern to me.
I think your question about whether Dürer's contemporaries were as aware of the material meanings of the techniques they used is a good one. And I think that the better of the artists must have been, because, being an artist means that one's work is very hands-on. You're handling the pear wood blocks. You're handling the copper plates. You know the paper. You know the press. You know the effects that are going to be created. I don't think that what happens is a surprise for, artists who are skilled in printmaking.
Yeah. But we do find that there are artists who are drawn to one technique or another because they have a facility with wood cutting, or, people think engraving is too hard.
I don't think that there's a lot of engraving that happens anymore. I mean, there's some, but it's not, I don't think, among the most common techniques. My next project is actually, the book will probably be called The Extinction of Print, because it's an opportunity to look at print matrices and how we go from wood blocks to copper plates to lithographic stones to sheets of plexiglass and acrylic. And, you get a smoother and smoother and smoother surface. And now so much is produced digitally that you've lost the analog matrix. And I think in a way that's a form of extinction.
Ah!
Something else emerges.
Oh my God. Oh, did you come up with this idea over a drink?
No, years of thinking about it.
That's right. It's well considered. But you've been looking at matrices for a long time. Are we in the gathering of facts stage, or are we thinking about writing?
The writing has begun.
Oh, wow.
The writing has begun. And in fact, this fall and spring at different institutions, I'll teach seminars on the eco-history of print that will allow me with classes to look at the materials that enabled reproducible images alongside conceptions of nature that informed the use of those materials.
Huh. Wow. Where are you teaching?
In the fall, I'm going to teach at UCLA, and in the spring, I'm going to teach at Princeton.
Oh, wow. That's cool. So my question about how one gets a book deal. I mean, proposing an exhibition makes complete sense. And if the institution has the wherewithal, they'll produce a book. Not every place can do so. But how do you get a book that's unrelated to a museum show published?
It's a good question. And I'm just going to step back a bit in answering it. This project about early European print and the Islamic East, I originally wanted to pursue as an exhibition. But because I'm no longer affiliated with a museum, it's hard to get an exhibition off the ground. They're expensive. Museums don't want to invest in curators who aren't on their staff. And so I had to change the scope of the project and make it into a book. And I pursued it as I imagine our academic colleagues pursue getting books published all the time. I was in touch with a university press, sent them a proposal. It was approved, and consequently, a book was made.
You make it sound so easy. So we have discussed on the pod before. I had Linda Holtz on, who wrote the History of Prints textbook. And we had this long discussion about how difficult and expensive it was to get all the dang photos. And, and I know that many more museums now than back then are allowing for free downloads and usage. But it's still, it's kind of prohibitive.
Gathering images can be costly. One of the advantages of writing a book on European prints, essentially, and on one of the most renowned artists who makes such prints, is that many museums have their prints photographed. And so you may have noticed that the majority of the Dürer images in the book have come from the National Gallery of Art's collection. And that is because the National Gallery of Art has very generously made those images available for download. You don't even have to interact with anyone at the museum to get them. There are rules for crediting them. You just follow the rules, you download the image, and it ends up in the book. I was really lucky that Princeton University Press was willing to publish the book, because I think that they're very attentive to how books look as well as how they read. Princeton engaged Connie Pirtle, a designer that I worked with before on Prince and the Pursuit of Knowledge, and his design firm, Pirtle Family Business. And he made, with Princeton, this very beautiful book, I think. So I feel really lucky to have fallen into a publishing situation that allowed for that.
Yeah, the illustrations are quite extraordinary and necessary because, because it's, some of it's like, well, what do you mean the guy on the hill with the scabbard? I can't see him.
Each of the chapters in the book is a case study, essentially. And each of them started as a lecture. And, when you write a lecture, you're essentially narrating a slideshow. And so what I wanted the book to do was replicate that narration of a slideshow. And Princeton was really generous in that they allowed me to repeat images in the book, so that the image appears initially, then you get different details from the image, and then you get the image next to another image for comparison. And it allows the images to tell a story alongside the text.
Art history is so interesting that way because the books are impossible without the images. You have to have the images in there. Yeah. Yeah, no, the book's beautiful, Susan. Really, congratulations.
Thank you. That's very much Princeton University Press and Connie Pirtle.
Okay. Well, your words are good, too. But I wanted to ask you about, you have also contributed to catalogs about contemporary artists like Jasper Johns and Coretta Kent. I know you're a very flexible scholar, but the brain space is pretty different looking at Johns versus looking at Dürer. How did you make the jump?
So you ask how I make the jump from 1500 to 1980, the year 2000, and more contemporary printed objects. And so while there is a great deal of distance historically, I think conceptually a lot remains the same. That all of the artists I've written about are makers who are interested in using a matrix to make a picture that gets impressed on a sheet of paper. And I think that if that is the shared principle, and you think about how things are made, why things are made, there is a lot of overlap. And, the Corita Kent project is, of course, one about an artist who was a cloistered nun who made screen prints at the same time as Andy Warhol and Ed Ruscha. And she was very much aware of what they were making and that it was all in conversation. I think it just means like getting to know a literature, which is the fun part of being a scholar, I think. Diving into new material. Yeah, I think it's, the scholarship is driven by curiosity, and you just follow what sort of sparks your imagination.
Well, and it also follows along the lines of thought I have had many a time, which is that people who are in the print end of art history, in my experience, tend to be people who are deeply curious and happy to jump from century to century because they are sort of voraciously absorbing facts and images and personalities and techniques. It's a kind of a different thinking pattern than the people who are in, medieval X and Renaissance Y.
Right.
Yeah.
And as we both know, as print curators, one is often responsible for a collection that begins in the 15th century and goes to the present day. And even if one has a specialty in one particular area, one has to be attentive to the entire history. Although I've never worked on the 18th century and probably never will. It's my hop over century. Who needs the Enlightenment? Caused all kinds of problems.
It did cause yeah, we just, True and I just did a 2-part episode on the Enlightenment, introducing the concept, and we started calling it the Enlightenment / Endarkenment / Enlightenment.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a problem. Before I let you go, I did want to circle back to one of your closing bits in the book about the knots and the canon and Caterina Cortano, about the printing press and our understanding of it as disseminating good religious things versus your unbelievable thought, which I'd never thought of, about how it caused, in some ways, the need for the Reformation.
So one of the driving forces behind the book is looking at the relationship between early European print and the Islamic world. And I think that early European print and the Islamic world are inextricably bound together in ways that we don't articulate. We were all taught at some point, either in grade school or high school or even college, that the first printed book, the first printed publication of note was Gutenberg's Bible. And if that's the starting point for printing, it offers kind of a rosy view of it. It's for devotion and understanding and all of the good things that religion proposes to offer. But in fact, the Bible did not come first. Gutenberg's workshop was printing indulgences that were intended to raise money to fight the Islamic empires, that he printed a call to crusade to try to get the European leaders to, again, fight the Islamic empires. And I think a very different history of print can be written if you imagine it as a medium that's used for division rather than religious unity and solidarity. And I even think that underlying all that was the idea of new communication modes like digital modes, social media. We imagine them as this way to network and gain friends and create communities. But in fact, it turns out that they're all pretty divisive and create partisanship and conflict and competition and ill will and all of it. So in looking at early printing, I wanted to suggest that there were other ways of understanding it that were not so religiously rosy in nature.
But I also love, I look at the printing press as being one of the most important inventions of, the human, whatever. But the idea that it was part of the machine that pushed Luther to write the 95 Thesis, the complaints about the indulgences primarily, like it just puts it front and center. Print is like nothing happens with us without print.
I think that print was a very powerful tool. And I've gotten to the point where I'm no longer willing to say that Gutenberg's printing press was an invention, was something of European origin. So another outcome of this project is that I'm involved in a research group now looking at the global origins of print.
Oh, good.
And going back to East Asia, to China and Korea, where there was movable type centuries before European movable type. It was hand-printed, hand-rubbed, but, it was still the making of movable metal characters that enabled the production of books and scrolls and text. And I think that there's a big difference between what was produced in the East and what's produced in the West and how they're produced and how historically we've come to view them, that undermines a lot of what we have been taught about Gutenberg and his so-called invention.
Sorry, shouldn't have used that word.
Oh, no. Everyone uses it. It's the word. It's the word. We learned Gutenberg invented printing.
Yeah. Well, and we try to make clear when we introduced the series of the history of prints that it was Western and that we had no business representing any history in the East because it's a whole huge other thing. So, but it's keeping going the idea that Western art history is its own little thing. So,
yeah. I went to South Korea for the first time this spring. And at the National Museum of Korea, there is an early printing installation. It's a permanent installation. And in a case is a piece of movable metal type from the 14th century of a Chinese character made of copper that has survived. And, it's astounding to see something like that when you've been taught, Johannes Gutenberg invented movable metal type in Mainz, Germany in the mid-15th century. So I think that the story just needs to be reimagined, more integrated, more global, not so biased, just as the whole world needs to be.
Indeed. Why is it that we don't know the exact date of the Guten? Is it?
I think it's 1455. I think that we do know.
Oh, we do know now. Okay.
We do know.
All right. I'm going to 1455.
But for years it was in question. But I think we're settled on 1455.
All right. It doesn't, in some ways it doesn't seem that long ago that we should not know. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, it's weird. All right. So next you're tackling the matrices, which is super exciting, in a book project, not an exhibition.
I'd love to do it as an exhibition, but as I said, it's hard to get an exhibition off the ground if you are not affiliated with an institution, a museum.
Preaching to the choir, babe. we are like peoples, which is not a surprise to people. I say it all the time. Yeah. Suddenly finding yourself as an independent is one of the most shocking and mortifying things that has ever happened to me. And I'm deeply proud of you and Helen and me for continuing and making changes and going down different paths, but still sticking to our guns.
I think it's also incredibly liberating. And I think that you've done an amazing thing by turning this print history interest into a podcast. It's great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. It's fun. I know that we've missed a lot of elements. If you ever want to come on and do a little deep dive on something, let me know. We're heading into Hogarth and Goya now. So, well, thank you for coming on Platemark. It's been lovely to catch up with you and hear your backstories on getting this project off the ground. The book is beautiful, and everyone should read it because it's a fascinating new take on Dürer, he's the guy. He is the man. Yeah, always has been, always will be.
It's hard to argue with. Periodically, I think, okay, I'm going to work on someone different. And I wander away, and then I end up right back in the Dürer camp.
There's a soundbite for you. Yeah. Brilliant. That's great. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. It was really fun to talk.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Platemark with my guest, Susan Dackerman. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. I found the book really fascinating, and I love talking to the author about her process and her thinking and her research and all of the things that go into making a really important new scholarly work on Albrecht Dürer, about whom there has been written a lot. But I love the thing she closed with, which was, periodically I think, okay, I'm going to work on someone different, and I wander away, and then I end up right back in the Dürer camp. It's perfect. Sums up Susan's career, I think, really beautifully, because, Dürer's the guy. We've always said it, and we still believe it. Let's see. Oh, thank you to Susan for being a great guest. I appreciate it, Susan. And also a thank you to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for being my sound guy. Thanks, Dan. And one also to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. And one to Lee Turner and Skip Barnhart for sending me studio sounds from their studios for the soundscape at the beginning and end of each episode. Images that Susan and I talked about are over in the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com, and you can do all sorts of other things over there. But, you could really just do me a favor and assign yourself the job of telling 10 friends about the fabulous podcast you're listening to and help me spread the word. Audience building is ongoing, as I like to say. All right, I think that's it. We'll see you next time.